we will, of course, give it time for people to arrive.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're getting participants. Laetitia, can you see that screen, the participants, the number of participants coming in?
Yeah, great. Yes, it's 12 people now. Yeah, it's good. Looking forward to discussing with everyone.
Yes, it should be a good discussion.
Okay. Nasrin John, we are live. You can start now or just give it another minute or two.
Yes, thank you everyone who's joined us. If with your permission, I will wait another couple of minutes in case people are just about to join us before I introduce our speaker and we start the program. Won't be much longer. Good. The number seems to have been steady at 21, so perhaps we can begin. Well, everyone, welcome to this wonderful presentation and session organized by the UCI Center for Persian Studies and Culture. I want to thank my colleague, the director of the center, Turaj Daryai, for facilitating it, and for also my colleague Saeed Jalalipour for setting up the session and helping us with the logistics. So thank you. Well, today, as you know, we have our distinguished speaker, Professor Laetitia Nanquette. I just will briefly introduce her before launching the program. So she's a senior lecturer in the School of Arts and Media at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, Australia. She studied in France, the United Kingdom, Iran, and the United States before going to Australia. She was a fellow of the Australian Research Council between 2015 and 2019. She travels to Iran for research, fieldwork, and translates contemporary Persian texts into English and French. Her first book was Orientalism versus Occidentalism, Literary and Cultural Imagining Between France and Iran Since the Islamic Revolution. That was published by IB Tauris in 2013. The work we're going to be hearing about on Iranian literature has her work, she has published on Iranian literature in leading journals, including Iranian Studies. The translator interventions, etc. Her current work, the one that we will be focusing on today, is called Iranian Literature After the Islamic Revolution, Production and Circulation in Iran and the World. It was published last May by Edinburgh University Press. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nanquette. And one little note about how we will be conducting the question period, Q&A. Professor Nanquette is going to give us a presentation first on the book, And after that, you will be able to, or at any time, you can put your questions in the Q&A, and I will attend to them in the order in which they are received. And Professor Nanquette has generously agreed to answer the questions after her presentation. Professor Nanquette, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Nasrin, for the kind introduction and for organizing this conversation. Hello, everyone. Good morning in Australia. Good afternoon in the US. Just checking you can hear me, see my screen and everything. All good?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So thanks to everyone who joined. I can see names of colleagues, friends and students. Thanks a lot for being here. So today I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes about my book. I'm going to speak about its main ideas and go into some of its details. I'll go into the details of one chapter, and then we'll have plenty of time to discuss. So the book is about the Iranian literary field after the revolution of 1979. It studies how literature, mostly prose, has functioned and circulated in the past 40 years, both within Iran and in the countries of the Iranian diaspora. And I focus on North America, Western Europe, and Australia because I lived in these countries in the past 12 years, so it made fieldwork easier. The first part of the book is on Iran, and I look at the forms, the structures, the functions of Iranian literature within Iranian society. And in the second part, I turn to the global diaspora. So the book is not a book about literary criticism. I don't do close readings of literary text. It's not either a socio-political approach to Persian text. It's basically a sociology of Iranian literature, looking at the functions of literature in the society in Iran and in the diaspora. I study Iranian literature after the revolution comparatively. So the comparison is on two levels. First, it's about the relationship of the literary field with other fields. So the political field, the social field, and the economic field. And it's also about the analysis of Iranian literature as a global phenomenon. And I compare countries where Iranian literature has an important place. It was very important for me to look at both Iran and the diaspora at the same time. Quite often there are research fields that are separate, and I really wanted to have this comparative aspect in mind. There's been a lot of amazing work done, especially on Iranian American literature, for example, in the past 15, 20 years. So I'm using some of this and expanding this scholarship to look at other countries as well, mostly France and Australia, and also to look at issues of circulation. So not looking at just one country. So I see Iran not only as a nation state, but also as an identity, as a belonging space, what Benedict Anderson calls an imagined community. And that's why I also study works written in English and in French, not only in Persian, because my idea is that literatures from Iranians across the world sort of produce small clusters of Iran outside the Iranian borders, either in Persian or in the local languages like French and English. So my aim in the book was to describe the Iranian literary field in all its complexity, in all its variations. I wanted to narrate several aspects of the story of contemporary literature. So what I said before, both what happens within Iran and in the diaspora, but I also wanted to touch upon the different fields within Iran. So the independent field, the underground field, the governmental field, which is often neglected in scholarship. I also wanted to look at canonical literature, as well as popular literature and children's literature. And finally, as I mentioned, all the different levels between the local, the national, and the global, and all the connections in between. So it's a pretty big scope, which is why I have refrained mostly from engaging too much with poetry, because poetry has slightly different dynamics. So it will be the topic for a different book, but on this note, there's an amazing book written recently by Fatemeh Shams on the poetry of the Islamic Revolution, which sort of complements what I'm doing in this book. So I think it's really important that all these voices and strands are taken into account to show the richness and complexity of Iranian literature today. Because if you compare it to classical Persian literature, which is widely considered to be rich and multi-layered, and it's got a long tradition of scholarship devoted to it, I wanted to offer some insights into the contemporary Iranian field, which is quite understudied, and demonstrate as well its richness and all its paradoxes and its evolutions as well. And I wanted to say this has been possible thanks to the many literary practitioners who have shared their knowledge and insight with me. And I want to say that I'm really, truly grateful to them. They've really helped me to understand the sophistication of the Iranian literary field, both in Iran and in the diaspora, and I couldn't have written the book without them. I want to touch upon the different readers and the different contributions this book is hoping to make. I assume a lot of you maybe are people working on literature or cinema, maybe culture in general, but some of you might be working on Iranian studies more generally, maybe in history or in politics. So I'd like to say something about the importance of culture for Iranian studies in general. Culture in general and literature specifically have been really central to the foundation of the Islamic Republic, and they have remained so since. So culture is essential to the ways it defines itself and to the defense of its ideas. If you think about, for example, the cultural production of Defai Moqaddas, the sacred defense, this is really crucial to the way the Islamic Republic defines itself. So cultural production is not an afterthought. It's really at the center of power. Culture is also understood by the regime as an instrument of soft power. If you think about, for example, the threat that it sees in the cultural production of the Iranian diaspora, the TV from Los Angeles, and all these things, you can see the importance of soft power for the Islamic government. And the last point on the importance of culture is that Iran is 9th on the list of countries that publish most in the world. There are also lots of institutions devoted to cultural production. So I believe that everyone working on contemporary Iran should be aware of its cultural production as well as the discourses around it. And that can inform their reflections on politics and history and other disciplines. Now touching upon the contribution to Persian literary studies. So there's been fantastic work in recent years done on Iranian culture in the diaspora. And the field has been really enriching a lot while I was starting to work on it. For a variety of reasons, there's been less on literature from within Iran. And what I wanted to do was to think about the two spaces together. Just to clarify, I'm not proposing that Iranian literature be read as global literature. Persian has been a global language, and Persian literature has been a global literature at other times, but it's not the case today. There are so many constraints to its circulation, as I explained in the book. So what I'm proposing to do is to read the production and circulation of Iranian literary products and persons globally by looking at several national contexts. And in doing this, in seeing the links or trying to understand the absence of links between Iran in the diaspora, I hope I'm pointing to something important to understand the field. So it appears that Iranian literature after the revolution is on the margins of the world system. It's not global as such, but perhaps it's important in several national systems, not only the Iranian one, because it speaks to several national literary contexts. And I go into the details of this in the second part of the book. And finally, the contribution for literature scholars generally. In the book, I hope to show how exchanges happen and often don't happen in a closed country like Iran. So the book also reflects on the globalization of culture in a context of enclosure. Iran is very much isolated from the rest of the world due to sanctions, due to censorship, due to other internal constraints. And I go into the details of these constraints in the book. Just a quick word about the methodology, just to say that the book is based on a mix of distant reading and close reading. So I've done field work and interviews. I don't really do close readings. I just go into descriptions of some sects, of some genres of literature produced within Iran. I also use digital humanities methods with large amounts of data. And I'm going to go into that today because I'm going to focus on the chapters that that deal with that. I suppose my French background has been important because I'm very influenced by Pierre Bourdieu and his theory of the literary field. So I've basically adapted it to the Iranian context and adapted it quite a lot because it's really different from what Bourdieu is theorizing, but it's really the driving theory behind the book, for those who know Bourdieu. Okay, now the main findings. I must say that some of my conclusions can be seen as maybe a bit bleak, especially when it comes to the enclosure of the Iranian field. As I mentioned, Iranian literature within the country has many constraints. You have the constraints imposed as a result of sanctions from the US government and the European Union. You have issues linked to censorship and lots of internal divisions of the Iranian literary field, mostly between independent and governmental. The gap between Iran and the diaspora is it's another element that adds to this enclosure. Actually, one of the conclusions I least expected to come to when I started the project concerns the relations between literary Iran and the diaspora. When I started to work on the project, my idea was that literary text and practitioners between Iran and the diaspora exchange a lot. I had been living in Iran for a year. I was traveling there often. I was listening to Tehran-Jealous music in the taxis and seeing DVDs of all sorts of films on the pavements of Tehran streets. And there were lots of exchanges in general, especially in music and cinema. And I thought that similar exchanges were happening in literature. However, my findings have largely shown that there's quite a divide between Iran and the diaspora when it comes to literature. In general, the Iranian diaspora is far-ranging. It's otherwise well connected to the motherland, but it's not so much the case when it comes to literary exchange, and definitely not on the same scale as music or as cinema. Because Iran is really quite isolated, it can be difficult to bypass the national borders, really. So in this context, the work that publishers, writers, translators, cultural institutions do to bridge this gap is really inspiring. And I want to insist on this and say that there are exceptions to this divide between literary Iran and the diaspora, which I look at in the book and which are really important. Something else about the diaspora is that I found that there's a big commitment by Iranian literary practitioners to their new homes. It might be surprising at first, knowing that Iranians tend to connect a lot with the national and cultural identity of their homeland, but it became evident to me that Iranian, what you can call, let's call it Iranian patriotism, does not go against a strong relationship to the national literatures of their adopted country. And in thinking about this, I've been inspired by Xu Meishi, who works on the Chinese diaspora. And to her, there's nothing inherently positive about being diasporic. And the conclusion I'm reaching with Iran is that while there may be little exchange across national borders, let's say between Iranian French writers and Iranian Australian writers, Iranian diasporic literatures are very well integrated into the different national literary fields to which they contribute. And in general, diasporic Iranian writers tend to be quite invested in their local literature. So to sum up on these findings, my conclusions might maybe go against the grain of some of the current thinking in the field of postcolonial and world literature, which talk a lot about increasing transnational exchanges and the disappearance of national borders. This is not what we see happening in the case of Iran and the diaspora. But these findings could not have been reached without studying the Iranian literary field with this global lens in mind. And finally, keep in mind that if it's true that Iranian literature is on the margins of the world system, it also plays a big part in several national systems. So not only the Iranian one, but also a constellation of imagined communities, Iranian communities around the world. So I'll just do a really quick description of the chapters now. That is a table of content. Sorry. So the first part of the book focuses on Iranian literature within Iran after the revolution. The second part is on Iranian literature globally and the nation's relations with the diaspora. In chapter 1, I look at the genres existing in contemporary Persian literature today. So from genre fictions like romances, crime stories, to the political genres that are specific to Iran. For example, the literature of the sacred defense, as well as religious literary text. In chapter 2, I look at the impact of the digital medium on the evolutions of contemporary Iranian literature. Especially I look at literary blogs and Instagram. Chapter 3 is a bit of a broad chapter that explains the divisions in the field between governmental, independent, underground. I look at the restrictions to the market, those internal to Iran, from censorship to constraints on paper supplies, and those external to Iran, from sanctions to lack of copyright agreements, for example. And I also look at two institutions, the Saadi Foundation, Bunyad Saadi, and the Union of Tehran Publishers and Booksellers, to try to understand how cultural institutions work and often overlap. In chapter 4, about which I'm going to talk a bit in more details later, I use the database from Iran Book House Khane Kitab to visualize the production and distribution of literary texts within Iran, and trying to provide new findings based on quantitative data. In chapter 5, I make a junction between the two parts of the book by discussing both production within Iran and circulation outside of the country. So I study the governmental policies about and institutions of children's literature to understand how this subfield has functioned in the last 40 years and why it's been quite successful both nationally and internationally if you compare it to adult fiction. Then in the second part, I look at the circulation of Iranian literature globally through translation and within the Iranian diaspora. In chapter 6, I reflect on the divides that exist between literary practitioners who leave Iran and those who stay. In chapter 7, I look at the translations and receptions from modern Persian literature in two places which are important for the Iranian diaspora, France and Iran. France and the US. Chapter 8 is about Iranian writers in Australia. They have quite a different history of migration and a literary production that's quite distinct from the rest of the diaspora. So it provides an interesting counterexample. And in chapter 9, I reflect a bit more broadly on the place of contemporary Persian literature in the Persian cultural system. And I make some comparison to Iranian cinema and visual arts. So that's about the general introduction to the book. I know it's always a bit abstract to talk about chapters like this. So I'm going to give you a bit of an example of chapter 4 to see a bit more concretely what I do in the book. And this chapter is about trying to understand book production and circulation since the revolution with large amounts of data using Khaneh Kitab, which is Iran Book House. And what I'm hoping to do in this chapter is to sometimes confirm some ideas which scholars of contemporary Persian literature are using. For example, we're talking a lot about the ebb and flow of publications according to politics. And I want to use data to show how this is working. And sometimes I'm going to contradict other propositions, such as that governmental publishers publish higher quantities of text than independent ones. It's actually they're more, a lot more independent publishers than governmental publishers. So Khaneh Kitab, so it's very well known by everyone in Iran that Ershad, the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance, buys copies of books important to its ideology. So the most reliable data that we have on the Iranian market is the publication of books before the sales. If I were looking at this in a Western book market, I would probably be looking at sales. But in the case of Iran, it's more meaningful to look at the production before the sales. So what I'm doing is comparing data from Khaneh Kitab to the discourse by literary practitioners that I've been exposed to when I was doing field work in Iran between 2006 and 2017, sort of. So I use Khaneh Kitab as my primary source to understand the production of books within Iran. I think it provides the most reliable data. You must remember that it's a governmental institute. It was established in 1993, and it's the entity that gives ISBNs to publishers. It also publishes journals, it organizes literary prizes, and so on. It is a governmental institute, so it doesn't take into consideration the books that are produced outside of the official networks that don't get an ISBN. And so we're talking about books published underground in the black and gray book markets. But this is quite a small proportion of original publications. So I think that's a reliable data. So I use 3 key resources. The first one is a report that Khaneh Kitab published in 2016 on statistics of book publishing in all categories. So it's not only literature, between 1980 and 2016. And it was on the occasion of the publishing of 1 million books since the revolution. So they also have an English edition, which is slightly different. So I use both of them because I have some variations. The second resource is data that I have obtained directly from Khaneh Kitab for literary books only. And this is in the form of Excel spreadsheets, which contain all the information on books in the category of literature for that same period. And Esmail Afrahi was one of the writers of the report, kindly shared this data and is happy for me to mention his name here. The third resource is the report Writer's Block, which was produced by the Independent Research Lab in the UK, Small Media. They don't have direct access to Iran, so the method was to scrap the data from the Iran Book House website. So here it's important to note that Small Media and the 2 resources from Iran Book House come from opposite political sides. Iran Book House is a governmental institution. Small Media is an institution based outside of Iran, which is clearly opposed to the foundational ideas of the Islamic Republic. But the fact that their readings of the data overlap mostly is a testimony to its validity and I hope to the relative accuracy of the construction of the data. So in terms of categories of books, we're talking about religious books, They're composing about 17% of publications, and children's and young adult literature is 14%, applied sciences the same, and literature is at 13%. So literature is quite important. It's almost equal to the most published categories. So what I want to do now is to give two examples of how I use the data. The first one to analyze the importance of who's in government on book production, and the second one is about governmental versus independent publishers. So literary practitioners in Iran always almost mention the years of Khatami's presidency as a golden age for publishing. That's 1997 to 2005. And they criticize the periods preceding and following it. So I wanted to look at how this compares with the data on the topic. On figure 1, you can see the evolution of the total market volume. So that's the total number of books published. You can see that the data for Rouhani's presidency, which is 2013 to 2021, shows small increase, but it's too small to be really meaningful. On this one, it shows the number of books published since the revolution according to small media. You can see that the Khamenei presidency, which also coincided with the war with Iraq, was a period of stagnation for book production. During Rafsanjani's presidency, which was a conservative presidency, there was a bit of an increase. The liberal Khatami was his minister of culture at the time, but Rafsanjani also had 2 conservative ministers during his presidency. Then you had Ahmad Masjid Jamei, a reformist, who had the position for the last years of Khatami's presidency. And it's only with Khatami's presidency that production really boomed. There was a decrease with Ahmadinejad's first term, which banned altogether some writers, which didn't allow them to go through the process of even submitting their books to the Ershad. And then another decrease at the beginning of his second term in 2009, which saw massive upheavals in the country and which had a really important impact on literary life with lots of people leaving the country. Actors in the sector mention Kitab Sazi, which means making up books, building books, as a factor to take into consideration when we count books during Ahmadinejad's presidency. So even if you can see a big decrease, it's probable that even less books were published, like less proper books were published during his presidencies. And a lot of, for example, PhD theses and master theses were counted in the total numbers of books published, which shouldn't be the case. And the third figure, this shows the similar data from the Iran Book House report, and that includes a few more years from Rouhani's presidency up to 2016. And I don't have data for after that. So the previous 3 graphs were the number of books published over the last 40 years. Something important to remember is that the number of copies is a different matter altogether. And there's been a huge decline in number of copies published per book over the last decades. Everyone mentions it, and this is a graph that shows this decline. So it used to be an average of maybe 8,000 copies published per book in the early years of the Islamic Republic. And a standard number in the late 2010s is around 1,500, maybe 1,000 copies per book title. So this figure really gives the average number of copies per book and confirms this drastic decline that everyone mentions. And there are many reasons for this, and the fact that the price for books has increased drastically. There's a shrinking economic space. There's a rise of ebooks, pirated books, the absence of copyright laws. There are many factors explaining this decrease. And the second topic I want to discuss and finish with is the topic of independent publishers versus governmental publishers. So the most prolific publishers, maybe contrary to expectations, are not religious and governmental publishers, but publishers working in the academic field. although it's not exclusive, but sometimes it is exclusive. The field of book exams preparation, Kitab et Concours, is huge. Those who know Iran knows that the entry examination to university concours is crucial to the higher education system. It's a whole industry in itself. So you've got specialist publishers like Mubtakeran, Gaj, and so on competing for this market. On this figure, this shows that from 1979 to 2016, governmental publishers published only 12% of books. Most books were actually produced by independent publishers, including the ones I mentioned, the ones publishing in the academic field. So today, independent publishers publish 7 times more books than governmental publishers. And here it's important to remember that even what I call independent publishers are not necessarily entirely independent from the government. And it's sometimes the line is a bit difficult during some periods. Most publishers received paper supplies, for example, from the government. So it was an important financial support. It's also common for independent publishers to receive direct funding from the government occasionally. So it's important not to draw a strict line between the two categories. And also to remember that all publishers in Iran, except the underground ones, have to stay in line with the government exigencies. So the distinction really between the two is mostly along ideological lines. If you are entirely aligned to the government or not, that's pretty much what makes the distinction clear between the two. So some governmental publishers are huge in size, thanks to the support they get from the government. You can think of Suremer, for example, which is the publishing press of the Hoseye Honari. But most of the publication in terms of numbers, as this graph shows, is done by independents. So when we're getting a bit in more details in the book, it's about who receives more political power or social power, and very often it's the governmental publishers who receive this support and the independent struggle. But in terms of numbers and figures, independents still publish the most. Okay, so I'm going to conclude by saying that I hope that studying different resources is producing cross-checkable and verifiable answers. And I want to end by reinforcing the fact that having a broad view of the field and using a variety of sources is, I think, really key to understand its complexities. And also to say that to analyze contemporary Persian literature, we cannot look only at the texts themselves. It's really important to understand how they are produced and circulated, because the ways in which the field is structured determines which texts are possible, which texts are impossible or even unimaginable. So thanks so much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks a lot, Nasrin.
Thank you very much, Laetitia. Before we go any further, I wanted to remind everybody that in the chat, you have the information for how you can obtain a copy of the book. Now, also, you can pose your questions in the Q&A via the Q&A function, and I will gladly pose those questions as I receive them in the order in which they come. I can tell you that I was immensely grateful for the tremendous information that you were able to tap into. And as you were talking about the received wisdom, of course, for generations of Iranians and Iranian scholars, what has obviously been a sort of a key point of discussion has been censorship. But you really open that up so much more, and we see that it's not a simple black and white thing. Let me read the first question we have received. You mentioned Shu Mishi. Please elaborate on this and the relationship with China.
Thank you. I was just trying to get into the Q&A questions. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I'm using Shumei. She maybe I'll just type her name in the chat.
That's a good idea. Thank you.
She's basically talking about the Chinese diaspora and Chinese literature in the diaspora, and I'm using her framework and her theories to think about Iranian diaspora because it provides similar ways to think about what we can call the lack of cohesiveness and the lack of coherence of Iranian diaspora, the fact that there are so many divides and, you know, a lot of political struggle going on in between different diasporic communities. And Shumei, she helps me to understand how that helps actually to create a diaspora that is more connected to its new national literary landscape. So for example, for Iranian Americans being very well connected to American literature, same for Iranian French writers being having a very big impact on the French literary field, but not so much in between diasporic communities. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, perhaps I could just add by saying that you don't really study the connection. There's no connection with China. You're really focusing on the literary field in Iran. And so far as your findings tell us, there isn't really any kind of issue in terms of, or there's no obvious connection there with China. This is using a scholar's work on diaspora. I'll read the next question. Can you further discuss how your French background has impacted your work?
Yes, so I mentioned the fact that Bourdieu's theory has been important for me. I suppose in terms of fieldwork, in terms of going to fieldwork, it's important for me to discuss how being French and a Westerner, non-Iranian, has impacted the access I have to some people and the lack of access I had to some other people. If I had been Iranian going into the fields, I might not have had the same access to certain cultural institutions or certain people. So I think it's important to keep this in mind because a lot of the book is about the field work, and my position in the field as a non-Iranian definitely has bearing on what I found out. Anything else about the French background? I suppose French and Iranian relations, cultural relations have been not too bad compared to other countries. So I've always had a very good experience on when going to Iran. People knew about French literature. We could exchange on cultural topics quite easily. So I think that has facilitated the fieldwork for me to be French compared to being British, for example.
Thank you. I'll read the next question and I'll just provide a little background to this. What is your approach to Occidentalism? I should point out that Professor Nanquette has written an entire book on the relationship between Occidentalism and Orientalism. But the question goes into this: how do you see the influence of anti-Western ideology of the Islamic Republic shaping post-revolution Iranian literature in independent publications? Do you think digital or social media can help as a tool fill this gap between inside and diaspora literature?
There are a lot of questions in these questions,
yes.
which is great. So Occidentalism, depending on how you approach it, but I suppose in the framing of your question, it's about the way the Islamic regime provides an anti-Western ideology and is built against, it's built on the anti-imperialist ideas that took shape during the revolution. Yeah, I want to say that there's been quite a lot of evolution on this in the past 40 years, because the anti-imperialist movement was, of course, critical at the beginning of the revolution. But even in the censorship laws, Nasrin mentioned censorship earlier, you see an evolution in the laws, in what you are allowed to say. You know, between the 80s and 90s, there's a big change, and one of the changes is about Occidentalism and anti-Western ideology. Later on in the life of the Islamic Republic, it becomes easier to talk about Western countries, as long as you provide a critical framework around it. So, for example, it's even possible to publish books on Zionism as long as you frame them and talk about the context and the history and so on. So I would say there's been a lot of changes, and indeed the digital media has been sort of filling in this space as well. I'm not sure about how that applies to digital media outside of Iran. There's, as I mentioned, there's this big gap between Iran and the diaspora. It's not as much the case on the digital space, but it is still present. So the two spaces are quite distinct, actually, and at least when it comes to literature, not in other places, but when it comes to literature.
There was a question about if books are published about minority religions. I wonder if you came across anything, because you really were working on literature. Your field focus was literature, so you may not have actually.
I haven't really
yes.
worked on this, but I know, for example, there's some books published in Persian on the Jewish minority in Iran. I came across some books written by Jewish Iranian writer talking about the history of Esfahan synagogues, I think. So that there are things published, not necessarily easily accessible, but yes.
The next is a comment, a note of gratitude. Thank you so much for your presentation. I love your work and have been following your work. I'd like to know if your book goes over the rise of digital online literature. The answer is yes. The author, I don't know if that refers to you, Laetitia, has written about Blogistan recently. I wonder if the literature on social media has been referred to in the chapter on digital literature. I mean, I enjoyed reading that chapter. So, Laetitia.
Thank you. Yeah, yes, this, I think it's chapter 2. Chapter 2 talks about Blogistan, literary blogs, and has a section on literary Instagram. So let me know, Yasmin, I can send it to you if you like. Thanks for your comments.
And from my colleague Susan Jarrett, who's a comparatist, I loved your point about the difference between a globalization of Iranian culture in diaspora versus the specific national connections, French, Iranian, Australian, Iranian, etc. Could you talk more about that?
Yes, thanks for your comments. Yeah, I suppose I wanted to talk about the fact that a lot of scholarship by Iranian scholars working on the diaspora have insisted on the fact that Iranians outside lack cohesiveness, and there's a lot of struggle. And for example, Amy Malek has an interesting interesting ideas on that, and says that the fact that we used to use Iranian exiles maybe up to 15 years ago to talk about the writers who left Iran, we're now talking about Iranian diaspora. Pretty much, yeah, it's quite standard. This reflects an ongoing reflection on what being an Iranian diaspora means, and I wanted to speak about the fact that although there are few connections between French Iranian, Australian Iranian, Iranian Americans, what they're doing is that they're being very invested very often in the national languages, so French, English, and have a big impact on the new national spaces. So the connections are not so much to Iran, to the homeland, because of the reasons I've explained, because of the sanctions and all the difficulty of the constraints. So the connections are really to the new country.
Thank you. Next question. You mentioned there's a divide between Iran and diaspora literature. Please explain more about this and the issues that diaspora writing is about. That's a huge question.
Yeah, that's a huge question. I've just answered a tiny bit of it, maybe by answering to Susan Jarrett's
yes.
comment. But I'm happy, Mansoura, I'm happy to, we can exchange by email.
Yes, thank you. Next, how does post-revolutionary literature differ from literature before the revolution? And in what ways does post-revolution literature better impact the diaspora? Well, I'll let you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and in a way, it's a bit artificial to separate post-revolution literature and pre-revolutionary literature. It's important. I mean, in the book, I frame the revolution as an important divide, and it has had really huge effects on the literary field within Iran and the diaspora. But it's also important to look at the continuities, and it's important to keep this in mind, because there are things that are definitely drastically changing and some other things that just adapt and change a bit. For example, I'm thinking about children's literature. Children's literature before the revolution is a really important field with cultural institutions like the Qanun, which was founded at the end of the 50s or early 60s, I forget right now, but it has had a long history, and the institution itself changes and people at the top change. And for a few years, the topics you can write about change, but then you sort of go back to what happened pre-revolution. There's been a lot of continuities in certain fields, and with the help of certain cultural institutions. So just to keep this in mind, that there are lots of changes, but also lots of continuities. In terms of how the two differ, they differ in terms of topics, in terms of styles and forms, and of course the framework that is implemented by the Islamic Republic allows certain things and blocks certain things from happening. But it's a huge it's a huge question. So maybe we can talk about it by email, Zoha, if you're interested.
I'm going to ask for your email. The quickest way to get that is Google her. I love how everyone is accessible. What made you interested in writing this book? What made you interested in Iran?
My interest in Iran started 15 years ago when I read Maulana Rumi in French translation. I really connected with it, and after that I started a year of Persian in Paris, and after a year of Persian in Paris I decided I really need to go to Iran. So I spent a year in Iran for the first time in 2005 and 6. And when I was in Iran, I was at the University of Isfahan first, and I met lots of students, lots of girls at the university who introduced me to contemporary literature. So that became really my thing, my interest. I was interested in understanding it, reading it, going into bookshops, going to readings, literary events. And really the book started out from this really very personal interest on contemporary Iranian literature and trying to understand how it connects to Iranian society. Yeah, I speak Persian, so.
Yeah, she speaks Persian. She's fluent in Persian. I can attest to that. And actually, I hope that many of you will buy the book and read it, because it's a tremendous lot of detailed information and parsing of the kinds of writings. So yes, that work would not have happened without, of course, knowledge of Persian. Thank you. I wanted to, if I may, use the prerogative of the moderator. As I got towards the end of your book, I was struck by the comment you made, which resonated deeply with me, about how literature does not have at the moment the same kind of resonance as the Iranian cinema or visual arts. So, I mean, this kind of, for those of us who were raised in the spirit of, as in Iran, the Iranian nation, the importance of Persian literature, and so on, it gave me pause, but it also made me think, yes, there is something of truth to that. So do you think that the study of literature will be impacted?
Do I think that the study of literature
will be impacted as a result, because there's kind of a waning interest in literature?
Yeah, I don't know. I must say that the book focuses mostly on prose, and poetry is slightly different. So I would say I'm more optimistic when I'm looking at poetry, because it has an important impact, in education, higher education, and just general life in Iran. But I think we already start to see the changes in the fact that literature is not being replaced, but being more interlinked to other media. So it's more linked to cinema, more linked to visual arts. And I would say it's not something specific to Iran. It's something we see in many places across the world. If you look at, the use of Instagram, for example, you don't have poetry on its own. You've got poetry with pictures and visual arts, and it's all becoming a big interlinking of media. So I wouldn't be pessimistic for the teaching of literature. I think we just need to look at the ways it's evolving and being being more interlinked with cinema, with visual arts, with digital platforms. And I think the fields of studying literature are different in Iran and in Western countries. So we're dealing with different dynamics. The issue in Iran is that there are very few places where you can study contemporary Persian literature. There's very few PhD theses written on contemporary literature. So that's one that's one area to work on, I suppose.
Well, I'll allow one last question by Khodadad Reza Khani, who says, I have a general question, but what do you consider to be a world literature at present? Is it something that relates to larger world issues, or is it dependent on languages that are used?
Thanks. It's a great question. It's a very broad question. I would say I don't consider Persian literature as world literature because it doesn't circulate a lot through translation. I generally use David Damrosch's definition of world literature as something that travels, that is translated, that gets out of its national borders. It's, of course, Persian literature is translated into French, English, German, Japanese, but in very small numbers. It's not something that we see a lot in the book marketplace. So it is dependent on languages, and of course Persian is used to be a language of culture and communication. It's not the case anymore. So a lot of the texts that could have an impact on the world book market are actually by Iranian writers, are actually written in other languages than Persian. You know, think about the memoirs like by Azar Nafisi, for example, that's been written in English. But it's a great question. I don't want to dismiss, you know, to just say that Persian literature is not global and it should be. I don't think it's necessarily the case. I don't think national literatures like Iran should, you know, fight to have their part of the cake in the world book market. I don't think that's the issue. But one of the things that is problematic when you're not traveling, when you're not being translated, is that there's less connections, there's less stories traveling, and when you have this lack of traveling, this lack of exchanges, then I think the national literature suffers a bit. So that's my take on this very broad question for now.
Thank you for all the questions. And I want to remind you what you see already in the chat, that you may subscribe to the email list, the center's list, and you can also visit the Facebook page. Please join me in thanking Professor Laetitia Nanquette for this magnificent book, which I read and I hope you will all read, and for this wonderful presentation today.
Thanks so much, Nasrin. Thanks so much to UCI Irvine for having me, and thanks for the great questions, everyone. It was lovely to be in discussion with you, and please don't hesitate to be in touch. I can send you chapters and we can exchange by email.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.